Morning. Around this time last year, if you happened to cross varsity basketball practice, you might have found Coach Ruskin in the middle of quizzing his players and sending the team on a down and back sprint for wrong answers. You might now guess that the questions on this quiz had to do with the positioning on a designed play or the rotation on a press, but you'd be wrong. Instead, the quiz covered an article titled "Defining Toughness in College Hoops," since expanded into a book simply titled "Toughness" by former Duke player and current ESPN basketball analyst Jay Billis. And when we think about toughness in sports, we might think about guys like Ray Lewis in football or some enforcer in hockey, players who can inflict punishment and who offer an intimidating physical presence. In fact, Billis argues something completely different. We commonly mistake anger and unrestrained emotion for toughness when, in fact, such qualities reflect the opposite of toughness. One of Billis's main points in the book comes from a lesson taught by his coach at Duke, Mike Krzyzewski, who said, "We are not born tough. We may be born into a great family situation or a difficult family situation that forces or conditions us to be tough, but we aren't born that way. Toughness comes from how we handle our experiences." So these gentlemen agree that toughness is a mentality that can be developed and improved over one's lifetime. Toughness is, in fact, a skill. Each one of us can actually become tougher. And when Billis talks about toughness in basketball, there are absolutely some physical challenges. Take a charge, dive on the floor, get in a proper defensive stance. However, he details the decisions that players make that define them as tough. Tough players take and give criticism the right way. Tough players show strength in their body language. Tough players look their coaches and teammates in the eye. Tough players move on to the next play. Essentially, tough players are not at the mercy of their emotions or of their stamina. They focus on the components of play that they need to be successful, regardless of the circumstances they find themselves in. And when you consider the toughest player you've ever encountered, the guy you hated to guard or to be guarded by, he's probably not the guy who threw the hardest or scored the most. He was probably the guy who didn't give up when you hoped he would. He was the guy who made you work harder and longer than you wanted to. He was the guy whose weakness was more difficult to detect and exploit. I bring this issue up today because, sure, it's worth asking, what can I do to be a tougher player? But I'd also challenge us to wonder, what does being a tough student look like? How about a tough friend? A tough son, a tough brother. At times, toughness means stepping backward and showing determination or restraint. At other times, it means stepping forward and advocating for yourself or others. One of the first stories that come to mind when I think about being a tough student is the time with my friend Dominic. Dom was my catcher on the baseball team in my final 2 years at Davidson College. He was one of my best friends, and we roomed together as part of a group of 4 whenever we had a conference weekend series on the road. Now, a side note about Dominic, he was one of the smartest guys I've ever known. Mrs. Finney may correct me on this, but my own anecdotal evidence tells me that most people have a particular aptitude in either language or numbers. I had a lot of friends who did well in English, history, and languages, but struggle in math, or who were flying through Calculus 2 in college, but struggled to write their term papers in the humanities. Dominic, of course, excelled in both, and was the only person I knew in college who was a double major in English and math. That was a rare combination. Anyway, one weekend we were traveling somewhere down south, and Dom said he had a math test to take over the weekend. I was wondering when he planned on taking it and how long he would need to finish it. He looked at me a little strangely and said, "Well, I'm kind of taking it right now." He went on to explain to me that the test was some level of abstract math that asked him to solve a single problem over the course of the weekend. Single problem. There weren't any calculations he could do to progress through the question. He simply needed to think about the answer. And think, and think, and think. Once he figured his way through the problem, he said the actual writing of the answer would take about 15 minutes. That was almost 20 years ago, and I still remember him walking around the hotel room, tossing a baseball in the air while the rest of us watched some game on the TV. Eventually, his facial expressions and mutterings grew somewhat more intense, and sure enough, late on Saturday night, he wrote out the answer. I've admired Dominic's approach to that task because he showed patience, determination, and restraint until he found his way through the problem. He did not give in to frustration, but he sat with the intellectual challenge long enough until he was able to overcome it. Now, you may never be faced with that type of academic trial, but I hope you can see the value in developing that level of mental toughness. I'm sure that most of you have asked every instructor but your science teacher what the purpose is of learning a particularly frustrating segment of the course. For English courses, that segment tends to be Shakespeare. Yet one of the many things I love about teaching Shakespeare is the fact that he requires students to think persistently until they start to see the patterns that help them to decode the poetry of his plays. In my mind, there's real value to sitting and looking at a text over and over again until some level of meaning reveals itself. A couple students each year say they can't do Shakespeare, and I would say that they are missing an opportunity to develop toughness by passing on that challenge. Yet we know that toughness isn't always about persistence and endurance. It isn't always about stepping back and moderating our emotions. Sometimes it's about stepping forward and doing something that we fear. The second story I have to tell is one that I carry with me always. In the spring of 1994, I was a freshman pitcher on a baseball team that would go on to be the number 8 seed in our 8-team conference tournament, so we weren't very good. We battled against teams like Western Carolina and Georgia Southern, who regularly won around 40 games per year and competed for a spot in the regionals. But that was just the start. After struggling against those teams and often losing 2 out of 3 games, we'd fill our non-conference games against nearby schools such as North Carolina, South Carolina, Duke, Wake Forest, NC State, and Clemson. Those games tended not to go very well. At any rate, I happened to be throwing the ball pretty well by that point in the year, so I was a weekend starting pitcher. A weekend starting pitcher struggling through Psychology 101. Here's another side note. If you didn't already know, Psych 101 with one professor is not Psych 101 with another. I thought I'd be learning a lot about behavior and suppressed emotions, but all I remember was a whole lot of brain chemistry. I really liked my professor, a young Davidson alum, but his specialty was in neuropsychology, and I was battling for my C+. These 2 pieces of my life met sometime in late April of that spring when I was scheduled to have a psychology test the morning after we had a Wednesday night game down in Atlanta against Georgia Tech, the number 1 ranked team in the country. That team featured future major leaguers Jason Varitek, Nomar Garciaparra, and Jay Payton, and ended up losing in the national championship game to Oklahoma later that year. On Wednesday after lunch, our team boarded 3 15-passenger vans and made the 4-hour drive down to Atlanta. Early in the game, we held our own, and my buddy Chris Pollard, who's now the head coach at Duke, was throwing the game of his life, holding a powerful offense down to just a few runs. Then around the 6th inning, my teammate Brad Edwards, making his first start at designated hitter, smacked a 3-run homer to grab the lead. Pollard kept pitching, but eventually tired with a runner on first and 1 out in the 9th inning. Our sidearm closer entered to face Jay Payton, who had a grounder to shortstop that started a 6-4-3 double play that ended the game and set off a wild celebration on the mound. Now that's the best part of the story, but that's not where it ends. You see, I found out about this amazing celebration by reading it in the paper the next morning back in Davidson. That's right, I didn't even go on the trip. Fearing that I would be judged as a poor student, I decided not to ask my psychology professor for an extension or for a makeup date for the test. Instead, I told my coach I needed to stay behind to take a big midterm. And so I missed the biggest victory that Davidson baseball has ever achieved, because some part of me was not tough enough to speak to my professor about a legitimate scheduling conflict. I sat back when I should have stepped forward. If you wonder about the value of developing toughness as a student, then consider for a moment what will be asked of you in the next few years. Potential employers won't be interested in your ability to recite a Hamlet soliloquy or to recall the quadratic formula, but you already knew that. They will expect to train you in the weeks and months after you're hired, so they'll want to know the ways that you are tough enough to step back and persist. And most of those tasks won't be physical or athletic in nature. Are you willing to wrestle with new information and new tasks? Can you solve a problem on your own by finding alternative solutions when your original strategy is either unhelpful or unavailable? They'll also want to know the ways that you're tough enough to step forward. Can you communicate clearly and effectively, in speaking, in writing, or in both, with colleagues, supervisors, and clients? Do you know how to appropriately ask for help when it's necessary? So I hope you think about how to improve as a student, whether you have 3.5 months or 3.5 years left at Salisbury. I encourage you to perform small acts of toughness to improve your skill at persevering through challenges, whether that's by working exclusively on academic tasks for the full 2 hours of study hall, by seeking help from teachers when your work is already adequate but has room for improvement, by speaking English and nothing but English outside of language classes during the academic day, or by cleaning up after somebody else in the dining hall. I also encourage you to step forward in order to make this place as good as it can be. Move courageously toward the spotlight in whatever way you can and show off your amazing mind, your sense of humor, and your personality. Because as we heard in today's reading, your playing small does not serve the world. I'll close by admitting that toughness is something I continue to work on every day. Regardless of your previous accomplishments, you learn how tough you are when your toddler dumps a bowl of pasta on the rug. My daughter, of course, is the best possible reason for me to be tough. She relies on me to maintain firm limits when she's crying, to keep my composure when nothing appears to calm her down, to exhibit restraint when emotions are running high. I hope that I can continue to improve so that whenever she needs me, I never let her down. I did leave out one detail that I really should reveal in order to complete the story. The last kick in the stomach from the Georgia Tech story is this: I failed the psychology test anyway. Thank you.